agenda items 4 and 6 are recorded by Hansard.
Agreed.
Apologies received from Martin Mueller and Peter Weir. Martin's flying halfway across the world. I don't know where Peter's flying to. Any other apologies? No. Draft minutes, pages 5 to 10 of your packs. Members content their accurate record. Agreed. Agreed. Matters arising. There's a letter from the Minister for Social Development to Mr Adrian McQuillan at pages 12 to 13 of your packs for members to note as agreed last week. Also can I remind members that arising from last week's briefing from the Consumer Council, the committee agreed to consider the scope for hosting a stakeholder event on the issues identified during the session, including potential measures to minimise the impact of bank branch closures and to tackle financial inclusion. Any initiative in this regard would likely be on a collaborative basis with the ETI Committee, given the previous agreement to this effect, and would be mindful that powers over banking and financial institutions are not devolved. It was also agreed last week that a final decision on the way forward will be taken in light of both the further work being undertaken by the Consumer Council and the forthcoming report from the NI Affairs Committee on its inquiry into the banking structure here. Can I also advise members that we understand the Westminster Committee's report is due in late February or early March, and is likely to make wide-ranging recommendations, including on some of the issues we discussed last week. In the meantime, the Clerk has liaised with the ETA Clerk on the potential for both committees to take forward the Consumer Council's proposal for a stakeholder event. In that regard, the ETA Committee recently commissioned research into banking services being offered by post offices, credit unions and other non-branch facilities, and this is at pages 14 to 16 also for noting. Can I advise members that while we await the publication of the Westminster Committee report and receipt of further research by the Consumer Council, the committee staff will examine the options for a potential stakeholder event for further consideration by the committee. Okay. And you want to add that, Shane?
No, it's up to date, sure.
Table requests, pages 27 to 31 of your packs for noting. I will move into the first evidence session then from the Carnegie Roundtable. This is at pages 33 to 38 of the packs.
Morning.
Morning, Edie. Okay, members. I welcome Aidan McGinley, co-chair of the Roundtable, Peter Doran, member and Carnegie Associate, Queen's School of Law, John Woods, member and Carnegie Associate, and Teresa Donaldson, a member of the Roundtable and Chief Executive of Lisburn and Castlereagh District Council. Does somebody want to kick us off with an update on where the group now is and the upcoming report?
Thank you, Chairman. And first of all, to thank you in a personal capacity for your leadership on this issue way back from the original conference, which members will remember. This little booklet I think you would have had copies of before, and we can certainly get you copies if you haven't, was produced and yourself and the Minister did the forward to that document, and no later than last Tuesday you very kindly addressed the Chief Executives Forum, which was a briefing that we gave to the public service. So we were delighted to be invited here this morning to also bring you up to date with where we are in terms of the roundtable, and in the first instance to pass on the apologies of Martin, the Chief Executive of Carnegie, who was with you the last time and unfortunately at short notice wasn't available. So I'm delighted as co-chair with Martin Evans to present an update today. We've been very busy since the last time we've met with you. We've held 4 roundtables, and you've met Peter and John before in their capacity as the Law School at Queen's, who've been doing the Trojan work of wading through huge amounts of evidence, which you yourselves as Assembly members will know what that's like. And indeed there will be a technical document that will be available on the Carnegie website with, I think it's running to over 100 pages as we speak. So that in itself tells you the quantum of evidence. And they have been wonderful support along with the Carnegie team in Scotland in supporting the roundtable, and then particularly to thank Teresa for coming along as a member of the roundtable, which in itself is a cross-section of representatives from business and public sector, some public servants in a personal capacity, the community and voluntary sector, health, education, a whole range of expertise at the table. We met 4 times during 14 and 15 to evolve the work, and in addition we were very conscious that this is a whole systems approach. It's about well-being in the true sense of everything as you live life, to try and look at life in the round. So we ran a series of focus groups across Northern Ireland with elderly people, young people, ethnic minority groups. We invited expert witnesses to present to the round table. We had written evidence from organisations including OECD, the New Economics Foundation, the Performance Unit of Scottish Government. We had a range of conversations with trade unions, business, the voluntary community sector and individuals. And indeed, one of the most important milestones for the roundtable itself was a visit at the invitation of the Scottish Government in June of last year to Edinburgh, where the Deputy First Minister, John Swinney, very kindly hosted us and gave us a very honest and inspiring insight into how Scotland, as our near neighbours, have applied an outcomes-based approach to wellbeing in terms of their performance framework. And from that we learnt a lot, and we also felt there was a real opportunity to apply the Scottish system, take the best of it. And indeed, they were very honest about not all of it works, that there's a lot of things that need ironed out, but I think there's lessons that we could gain from in that very quickly. So what we're also feeling is that the time is really ripe. Indeed, coming up in the car this morning, listening to the radio, wellbeing featured a couple of times in both the health debates and also in the members in local government, and the training that's happening today, wellbeing and community planning. And in that context, we're very aware you've got Programme for Government, the next Programme for Government coming up. You've got the Public Sector Reform Programme. You've got local government reform with the power of community planning, and we've got austerity, full stop, and the need to be able to prioritise our decisions in a way that's actually meaningful. So we're looking to see, can we develop this outcomes-based approach that we measure what matters, and I know that's of particular relevance and interest to this committee, and that it's about improving well-being and helping policy development in that climate, and then looking to next steps. And we're hoping to report at the beginning of March to the Executive with a report of and recommendations. And really, without further ado, I'm going to introduce colleagues now to give you a little bit more of a flavour of what it is our findings have been. And Peter is going to start off looking at the narrative and framework.
Thank you very much, Aileen. I'd like to make 3 comments. Just one around the backstory to what we're doing around the wellbeing agenda. I'd like to talk a little bit about what we mean by wellbeing within this particular context. What we're really talking about is societal well-being, and then finally just talk about scrutiny. You could say that there's a global dimension to this. There's a global conversation being driven by organisations like the OECD and the UN, and there's a local dimension. There's a real appetite for some of the implications of this work within the system, within our own systems of governance. So globally, this conversation goes back in part to 2009, to the Stiglitz Commission, the Commission on Economic Performance and Social Progress. And this, sometimes it's called GDP+. How do you move from a focus on a single economic production-based indicator, serving as a proxy, or rather weak proxy, for measuring the well-being of our societies? How do you measure or move from that to a richer, more textured baseline of information that allows you to look at the real impacts of policy, the real needs of society, the real choices that people are making and that are valuable to them? Now, locally, the agenda also implies a whole series of transitions, I suppose, or reforms in how we approach policy design. For example, a more preventive approach, a more collaborative approach across departments, people working together, not simply to gain efficiencies, but to reimagine some of the problems that we're trying to address some of the wicked problems around the environment or finance, for example. And the journey that we've been on on the round table over the past 12 months has been quite a revelation. It's clear that the implications of the wellbeing agenda, insofar as they take us towards a more collaborative approach, a more outcomes-focused approach to policy and measuring impact, a more evidence-based approach, greater transparency, greater engagement and understanding from the public, a greater range of think tanks and inputs into the policy process, partnership at the levels of policy making. But those implications, it's clear that there's a real appetite and a readiness across the public sector to take this agenda forward. People are simply waiting for the mandates and the cues within their departments, within local government and within partner organisations. So in a sense, the momentum is there, and what we're offering is the linchpin that will allow some of those aspirations, which are already there within the sector, within the public sector, to move forward. We want to fire the starting pistol, and we're offering one way to do that, which is the framework. Secondly, societal well-being. Well-being is normally associated with physical and mental health. Now, societal well-being, of course, includes those things. But we're informed by the work of one of the people who sat on the commission with Joseph Stiglitz, the thinker Amartya Sen. And for him, well-being is not a highly prescriptive, detailed definition. It consists of two things. It's those functions that we all value, whether it's good relationships, access to a good, secure source of employment, health, mental health, of course, a good environment. Okay, so it's the things that we do and want to be. And then, of course, it's also the capabilities, all of those structural elements that allow for the freedom to pursue those lives that we value. So there are important determinants of those freedoms to pursue the lives that we value. Equality is one of them. A healthy economy. Democracy. So it's interesting, the societal well-being model also harks back to some of the stories that have emerged within Northern Ireland over the past few years. We think in terms of the Prince's Trust research that reported this time last year, and the connections between depression in our young people, self-harm, suicidal tendencies, linked very explicitly to their experience of being excluded from the job market. Another interesting dimension of societal well-being is the way in which Sen talks about the way in which democracy, the health of our democracy, the quality of our participation is in itself a contributor and a reflection of our societal well-being. So this agenda is a means and an end. It's about engaging in a healthy way in our democratic process and contributing to it as well. But finally, one of the things that we track very closely within the Scottish experience is the role of scrutiny. And the framework is increasingly becoming a centrepiece for the Finance Committee. In the latest draft budget, there was a 2-year aggregate assessment of all the outcomes across government to assist the Finance Committee in its scrutiny and tracking of the outcomes. And the Finance Committee recommended to all of the committees in the Scottish Parliament that they also use the scorecards based on the analysis derived from the framework. So it's becoming part of an accessible and striking part of the scrutiny process. And they're not only measuring the information around outcomes, and the backstory here in Scotland and the backstory here potentially is all of the changes in the way that we do things, the shifts in institution, the shifts in culture that need to accompany this agenda. So in many ways we're scrutinising the effectiveness of those reforms in the system that support the framework as well. So those are my opening comments. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Peter's talked about the framework, and perhaps the centrepiece of the Roundtable's report is the proposal for a wellbeing framework. And we see this framework as having three essential characteristics. It would be shared across the whole of government and across parties. It would be long-term in its vision, and it will be clearly focused on outcomes. And while the Roundtable started its work by looking at the business of measurement, we swiftly concluded that a relentless focus on achieving well-being outcomes was the priority. This approach has clearly resonated with just about everyone we've spoken to. Perhaps one of the things that the Roundtable has tapped into is a growing feeling that inputs, outputs and targets are all very well, but if they don't produce results that actually make a difference to people's lives, then we need to take a new approach, one that ensures that all those inputs and outputs actually lead to an end result. So we looked at work in the area by OECD, by the Office for National Statistics, but we were particularly struck by the Scottish National Performance Framework, Scotland Performs. And although our proposals are rather different from the Scottish framework, looking more closely at it is a good guide to the Roundtable's thinking. So in the words of the Scottish Government, the National Performance Framework is, firstly, a single framework to which all public services in Scotland are aligned, encouraging more effective partnership working. It's a clear, unified 10-year vision of the kind of Scotland we want to see, they want to see. A tool to support delivery of the Scottish Government's purpose and priorities, an assessment of Scottish national well-being, a framework based on delivering outcomes that improves the quality of life for people in Scotland rather than on inputs and outputs. So if I can ask members to look at the final 2 pages of the briefing note we supplied, you'll see that the Scottish framework succinctly presented its headed National Performance Framework. And at the apex of that framework, at the top of the page, sits an overarching statement of purpose to which the whole of government across Scotland is committed. And for Northern Ireland, we're proposing that well-being is the agreed collective purpose of government. So the key element of the first page is actually that list of 16 national outcomes. And they are long-term, and they cut across more than one department. Progress on those outcomes is measured by indicators which are shown on the other side of the page. And these indicators are publicly available, and they're used to present performance scorecards to parliamentary committees, which, as Peter mentioned, is an aid to scrutiny. The point here is that all parts of government are aligned behind these outcomes. It isn't 1 or 2 outcomes per department. A number of departments and agencies may have a role in shifting just one indicator, either collectively or separately. Collaboration and that ever-elusive joined-up working are the prizes that now seem to be within the grasp of government in Scotland. So the Roundtable is strongly of the opinion that the forthcoming programme for government and future programmes for government is an opportunity to implement this kind of collaborative approach so that the 2016-20 programme for government reflects long-term shared outcomes and aligns the entire public sector and beyond in making progress towards outcomes that will make a real difference to the lives of citizens. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Chair, members of the committee, I'm going to try and link what you've just heard to the reform of local government. The members of the committee will be well aware that local government reform will culminate in the reduction of local councils from 26 to 11 on the 1st of April 2015, and also that the Local Government Act is now in place, and from the 1st of April the new authorities will have planning powers transferred and will have a statutory duty to initiate, maintain and participate in community planning for its district. The Community Planning Foundation programme produced by Department for Environment in partnership with local government defined community planning as community planning aims to provide the connection between regional, local and neighbourhood levels through partnership working and better use of all available resources, with a focus on collaboration between organisations for the benefit of citizens accessing services. And while there have been good practice examples of cross-agency collaborations in Northern Ireland, there is general agreement that the statutory obligation placed on the new councils provides a different and an exciting opportunity to develop citizen-focused services in a way not experienced in Northern Ireland. While community planning powers are new to Northern Ireland, similar powers were introduced to Scotland in 2003. There it is recognised that community planning has an important role in the Scottish Government's outcomes-based approach to delivering its objectives. The Scottish Government's National Performance Framework underpins this approach. The framework, as you've heard, sets out the Scottish Government's purpose, its strategic objectives, and the national outcomes it wants to achieve, with also national indicators that track progress towards the achievement of the national outcomes. In 2007, the Scottish Government fundamentally changed the relationship between central and local government through a process called a Single Outcome Agreement. These agreements set specific shared outcomes for community planning partnerships, bringing together health services, councils, fire, police, voluntary sector and community representation. Single outcome agreements are based on the National Performance Framework, but with local flexibility, allowing community planning partnerships to focus on locally determined priorities. On agreement of the outcomes, financing is agreed with no ring fencing from the Scottish Government. A concordat between the Scottish Government and the Confederation of Scottish Local Authorities, and I think we can read NILGA for that, was agreed, setting out the terms of the new relationship based on mutual respect and partnership. The Single Outcome Agreement guidance states that the direction provided by the National Performance Framework is central to community planning, and that single outcome agreements should demonstrate how local outcomes relate to one or more of the national outcomes. While it's clear huge strides have been made in the 10 years since community planning was introduced to Scotland, the Scots are the first to accept that there's still a distance to go. Following a review of community planning as part of a review of the future delivery of public services in 2011, the Scottish Government and COSLA published a shared statement of ambition, putting community planning at the heart of an outcomes-based approach to public services in Scotland, and made it clear that effective community planning arrangements would be at the core of public services reform. A national community planning group was established to play a pivotal role in implementing and communicating the overarching vision for community planning and single outcome agreements, identifying and addressing issues that have a national dimension and building the skills and capacities of partnerships. That was in 2012. In 2014, Audit Scotland published a report drawing together key learning from a number of audits on community planning partnerships. This report's called Community Planning, Turning Ambition into Action. Some of the lessons learned that we in Northern Ireland need to listen carefully to concern the need for leadership, scrutiny and challenge to be more consistent, and for a clear focus on how community planning will improve outcomes for specific communities, reducing the gap in outcomes between the most and least deprived groups in Scotland. Thank you.
Chair, that's a brief overview. I think it shows the amount of information. We'd like to stress the appetite there is for this. We've been very impressed with the energy behind the agenda. We feel that we can help with this work, the Executive to take a next step towards a new approach that will help in the challenges of judging priorities and when resources are limited, what level of scrutiny, changing culture, aligning central and local government, which there's a one-off opportunity to do the joining up there and getting right down to community level, and also creating an opportunity for a wider community narrative. A lot of the councils are already setting out on survey work, etc., with the new areas and identities, and we feel if well-being's at the heart of this and we explain it and keep it simple and practical but effective, there's a real opportunity for the Executive to use this as a means for driving forward a lot of things that are now coming together.
Thank you, Aidan. Can I congratulate you, first of all, on the work that you've done to date. It's certainly, there's a lot more on the bones of this than there was this time last year. So good luck with the rest of this particular journey. There are a lot of challenges, obviously, in this. And part of the conversations we had last week touched on this, and I think perhaps for members and for the public, they need to get their head around what well-being is. But you can publish a document, you can have your objectives, your aims, and it could sit on the shelf with all the other documents and strategies we've had down the years. So I think key for me is the accountability mechanisms, about the other key players in terms of the public, in terms of the media, and of course within government in terms of the civil servants and the leadership within the public sector. I'd be interested to hear more about the Scottish example, because obviously this has been in operation for some time now. So is it the case that in Scotland they publish this on a quarterly basis? Is it one of the main items on the news that the indicators are going up or the indicators are going down? And also in terms of the committees, I think you mentioned the Finance Committee there. You know, how often do they look at the issue of well-being? Do they have officials up every quarter to look at the well-being, to look at the indicators, or is it spread across all of the departments in Scotland? And also in terms of Scotland, how key was it the decision to de-silo government there, which was taken by the head of the civil service?
I'll let John and Peter go into the detail, but one of the things that was really impressive on the study visit was the depth that this went to within departments. So, for example, we looked at justice and children and young people as two areas of particular work, and they literally, in each area, instead of measuring the number of police officers per budget, they were looking at levels of safety in communities and perceptions of safety. You know, so they completely changed the dynamic. You still had the number of police officers in the budget, but the actual outcome being looked for was different, so it was reframed. And they'd literally worked it right down to divisional and operational level that reported through the departments and then out into the departmental committees and then into the annual, you know, the Finance Committee. We also have had conversations with the Audit Office, the Northern Ireland Audit Office, and briefed them, and they're very keen to work with us on a scrutiny focus. And a lot of it's about the culture of a positive culture of lessons learnt and being held to account with clarity about what it is we're being held to account to. And there's a lot of this is about aligning departments to work instead of silos to work together. For example, on things like children and young people, that straddles probably nearly every department without exception. How do you join all of that up? And if they're given a single target, how does that all weave through? And we saw detailed evidence of how they've managed to do it. They were very honest about where it didn't work or where it hadn't worked, but what was most impressive was they said, so this is what we did. One of the things they mentioned was that they hadn't done enough at the outset. It was actually quite very honest of the Minister, where he admitted that SNP hadn't expected to win the election. And they only had a number of 2 months in which to get a programme for government together, so they'd nothing to lose. And there was a freedom in that where they literally jumped in and said, right, we're going to go for this. And then they said if you were doing it, you know, by the book, you would have done a massive consultation across. So they're 7 years later, now only starting to do some of the consulting and setting up some of the mechanisms, like the leadership group that Teresa mentioned, are new. You know, if you were doing this by the book, these are the sorts of things you might do in sequence. So some of the lessons are, you know, to jump in there and do it. In terms of some of the detail, Peter and John have been immersed in it. Do you want to pick up on some of the questions posed there?
Yeah, no, I would. First of all, I think when we spoke to you last time, we suggested that you might consider a visit to the performance unit in Scotland. We've found our colleagues in Scotland extremely helpful, and there's really no substitute for sitting down with people like the Deputy Minister, First Minister now, John Swinney, and Sir John Elvidge, the former head of the Civil Service, who again has been very generous in explaining the background to this. And I think, as you say, this can be regarded as a technocratic bit of work, you know, or a document and information. But behind the piece, the backstory, is the partnership between the senior civil service, led by Sir John at the time, and the parties in the coalition in 2007. And I suppose there was a convergence, and the convergence was around this thought. At the highest levels of policy making, there was this thought that we know what needs to be done, but it's not what we're doing. There was a disconnect. Signals weren't there, the cues weren't there. We're putting money into policy and areas that we want to shift, but it's not happening. So Sir John worked with the senior politicians on a streamlining, the creation of a government reimagined, if you like, as a single organisation. And the framework and the outcomes approach complement that. It's the linchpin of it, but it's really about a culture shift. It's about alignment. It's about supporting the methodologies that support an outcomes-based approach as well. So it's about the detailed methodologies that support a new approach to design and evaluation. Taking a more modest approach to what you can plan and focusing more on evaluation after delivery. In terms of the frequency, the objective is to have near real-time information so that the political representatives and the public and the various actors involved, the partners involved in helping to deliver outcomes, have a picture of what's happening. And one of our recommendations will be using the latest data visualization so that information is meaningful and accessible to the public as well as the legislators. If I'm not breaching protocol, I have some of the documentation that is used by the committee system in the Scottish Parliament. And as I was saying, the Finance Committee in particular have been pushing their colleagues across the piece in all the committees to use these to help scrutinise the outcomes across government. And I suppose, yeah, the bottom line was that Sir John was able to, he had the privilege of dismantling the traditional departmental system so that form now follows function rather than policy following the imperatives of the civil servants and the existing structures. So it's a smart piece, but it's more than a framework. It's about all of the mechanics. Thanks, Heather. And ensuring that in the background that the wheels are not spinning idly while this framework is up in lights.
I just add, Chair, you made the point about they were able to de-silo and take that radical step of abolishing departments. Clearly that's, even if we wanted to, it's probably not a luxury that's open to us here. So we've been looking at, so how could we encourage ways of cutting across those departmental silos, and just the very existence of the wellbeing framework, I think, can help with that fundamentally. Specifically, of course, how it's translated through the programme for government. And there's an interesting development in the Stormont House Agreement, which allows for the programme for government to be agreed before the D'Hondt mechanism has been run, which could have the impact, a benign impact, of enabling parties to agree a number of shared outcomes, hopefully that would flow from the wellbeing framework in advance of D'Hondt. And so a more collaborative approach at that political level, which then can cascade down through the programme for government to delivery through the different levels of government. The other aspect, which is probably a little bit longer term, is budgeting for outcomes. And that would be beginning to align budgets behind the outcomes that government collectively wants to see. So rather than strictly departmental budgets, one could allocate the budgets to the outcomes, and then depending on what contribution different departments and agencies were making to those outcomes, the budgets would then be determined by that. It's quite a complex area. It's an area that I know you've looked at as a committee. There's a very interesting research report on that issue, but it's one which we'd certainly encourage you to continue to look at, because ultimately that probably is the best way of getting collaborative working right across departments.
In terms of, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, so that is the sort of form of reporting, just to give you an example, and each committee would get its information, and that then's collected for, you know, the annual reporting out. But the thing about it is, as you can see, it's quite simple in terms of the public as well, so that at a glance the public get a sense of, you know, skills or internet use or housing need or whatever. And that's deceptively simple. I mean, that's the other thing to assure the committee is that NISRA, who were on the round table, have been doing a lot of work already. I'm sure you're aware of the wellbeing work they did last year, which they're updating at present. So we feel they're well placed to start to be able to get this form of information ready for members and for the departments. And there will be a big piece of work done, or needs to be done there, to ensure that comes through. But we would be reassured by what we've seen of NISRA's work as well here, and they're drawing heavily on the Scottish model.
What response have you had from the Department of Finance and Personnel, from the Minister, and also in terms of OFM, DFM, who would be a key player in this too?
Very strong. I mean, the Minister's very supportive. Obviously, keeping as you yourself, Chairman, on the committee, you know, a watching brief. This is very much, we feel, us doing work to present you with evidence and findings for you to help you make your decisions. And the Minister's very minded and has said to us he's looking forward to receiving the report, and to internally within the system we've been very heartened by the willingness of public servants at all levels, including senior civil service, who were, in some of them in a personal capacity, OFM, DFM, DSD and so on, were actually on the round table. So we feel there's a lot of very good practice already existing in Northern Ireland, that this is about the piece that connects it all up. There's work being done in the councils in Lisburn and Derry, Londonderry and Belfast. There's work being done in, you know, everywhere from Irvinstown to Colin Glen, and people have come to us with that type of evidence to show they are using this type of approach on the ground and it works. But there hasn't been a context in which to place that work. So it's bottom up and top down. We think there's a lot of willingness to actually give this a try.
Yeah, I think at the Chief Executives Forum, I thought it was quite significant that the Minister indicated that his vision for this is that the framework offered something that might sit under the PFG, the Programme for Government, that it would help to organise the future evaluation and tracking of the delivery of key commitments in the Programme for Government. And that was our own thinking. And we were, as Aidan said, we're very heartened by the Minister's commitment. I think Mr Hamilton has also made a connection between this work and the public sector reform agenda. It's one of those areas where I was saying that we're talking a language that offers a way to bring a number of existing initiatives together. And that's the same within OFM, DFM. It's about delivering social change, but moving from a project-based approach to a scaled-up, system-wide approach, an outcomes-based approach, where collaboration is the name of the game.
And it creates, I think, a common ground and shared agendas, particularly, I think, having local government and central government experience myself. I think this is a prime opportunity, and I know that Teresa can speak about local government's appetite for it as well. And I think there's a real opportunity here for bottom up to meet top down in a shared agenda that in itself is groundbreaking in Northern Ireland.
Yes, Chair, community planning, I mean, you'll be well aware local councils are all making the initial preparations for the community planning powers, which will begin on the 1st of April. There is a huge opportunity there to involve our citizens in developing a local plan, which can then, through the mechanisms that we see in Scotland, and particularly if government starts to look at the potential for a single outcome agreement. Now, we will have a performance improvement framework through the local government reform programme imposed on us, which I think we're all welcoming. And there are a number of measures included in the consultation that's out at the minute on waste management, on economic development and on planning. But there's the opportunity to expand those lists of improvement areas and to look at the work that's been done in Scotland, and particularly the National Performance Framework, and join up the outcomes that the Executive would like to see coming forward from local government, join up those outcomes with central government and certainly there's a strong appetite from local government to have that kind of joining at this stage with the reform that we're all going through.
In terms of the media, then, what buy-in has there been in Scotland? Because, do you get articles in the Scotsman about well-being figures are going generally up or down? Is it on the agenda in terms of the media? Do they take it seriously as they should?
Yeah, but my sense, one of our Scottish colleagues have been quite frank about the way in which they really began this process as an internal process, and they have been working now on the public engagement, and I think that's also the case with engaging the media around this, getting the media to use this. And of course, as the Minister pointed out, Mr Hamilton at the Chief Executive Forum, there's a risk around this as well, and that we want to encourage all of the players, including the media, to see this as a positive learning opportunity rather than another opportunity to beat legislators over the head with performance outcomes that might not be going in the direction that we had anticipated. But yes, I mean, we are quite keen to talk to the media about the framework, and we'll be doing that as part of our implementation work following the launch of the report. But it's something that the Scottish are working on, and it's I think, if I take your point, it's something that has to be managed as well as taken out to the various media organisations.
And if I can also add, the advantage I think in some of this work is the fact that Carnegie have backed it with 100 years experience of working and well-being, and they have got an international, and we've talked a lot about Scotland this morning, but there's world practice, global practice that Carnegie are fully versed in, and I think that independent voice in presenting a report to the Executive and Assembly adds value from a media and indeed any other viewpoint, in that there's no, in inverted commas, agenda. This is a piece of well-grounded research that has looked specifically at Northern Ireland in the Northern Ireland context, and is saying, here's what we think could be done. There's a journey here. There's a 7-step journey we've identified with a series of recommendations about how, and some of it is around the building of capacity within the system, the alignment of the system, the opportunity to create a narrative in the community, in the wider community, which is something, for example, I think the media would be very keen to be involved in. And we are developing a detailed advocacy plan around the report, so that we get the information out, make it understandable. And that we think that will be of interest to the media, and obviously we'll be presenting, a very honest opinion. This takes courage. It's a major change in culture. It's a major piece of work at a time of change when people are busy doing other things. It's about saying no to things as much as it is saying yes, but that you've actually got well-grounded evidence and really the courage of conviction when you're saying yes. You're saying yes because you can't do everything. So what is it that's really important in Northern Ireland? So I think there's a story there that anybody in the media will want to know. And we, as the round table, are very aware of the influencing of the public and getting the message out, that the media have a very important role to play there.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Chair. Sorry, the panel for my phone going. A bit crazy, but actually it's an area that I'm very interested in, even in across the piece, because I think even your point, Peter, around things like think tanks, I think Northern Ireland probably has invested a lot over 20 years in things like our peace process, but we haven't probably done any real policy development, think tanks, that type of area. So too much of our politics and too much of our isn't based on real policy that you're particularly pushing. I think round, I'm very supportive. If I get the chance with my private members bill, that would be one of the things about extending that period from elections to running of Dahan, so that you have time to negotiate a programme for government, proper programme for government, a meaningful one, and you might even include in that movements of functions of departments to what's best suited to what configuration best suited your delivery of any new administration's programme for government and their priorities. I think you would also want to include in that broad budget headlines as well, because we're in a place now that it's all about defending budgets rather than the outcomes, and there's no point in me saving money if, you know, Judith's going to get the good out of it in her department. You know, we've too much of that, even when you come to local government. I think probably from about here to around, say, if Stormont is broadly setting sort of policy and strategy, you would want local government to be certainly at the forefront of being part of the delivery arm of that. But it's how you make that happen. I think it's good that our local government is broadly something like 70% of your finances is raised in the rates, which it gives you a good contact between ratepayers and what services you as a council are providing. But again, and that's why I included, made amendments. I would like to see local government more getting into an executive model of government with a scrutiny role, an oppositional role for people. I mean, from the Scottish experience, have you found that it's been easier because of their model of government with a single party in charge? I mean, one of the big weaknesses, I think, from our system isn't as much that there's 5 parties in charge, it's the idea that it's collective cabinet government. You mentioned about the government moving forward as one unit. Our problem is our government doesn't move forward and doesn't act as one unit, effectively can act as 5 separate units depending on ministers in their own departments have a large degree of autonomy over what they do in that department with no coordinating role. I mean, so is there a big difference between what the Scots can do because of one party, or is it even just the fact of we need to get to a point where we have an agreed programme for government, outcomes based and focused on how we're getting there, with almost at the centre with OFM, DFM being a coordinating department to make sure government's delivering on its priorities?
Certainly, it's interesting that Scottish experience that, like Peter mentioned, it was started off as a minority government and having to do things in coalition with other parties. And one of the experiences that's recorded and something we were told about when we were in Scotland was that this actually has something that's cut across parties and has encouraged collaboration between parties. And it's even expected that even should there be a change of government in Scotland, which I suppose isn't that likely at the moment, the way the electoral politics are going there, but if there were a change, they would expect the performance framework to remain and for those long-term outcomes to remain. So it seems that has encouraged collaborative working. So I think we could read a certain amount across to our situation, to that all parties could agree long-term outcomes. Of course, there's political debate as to how you then implement them. But if those are agreed, and the programme for government period before DeHont seems to be an opportunity to do that, along with a great deal of work, we think, between now and the next programme for government, the coming year, is quite an opportunity to start building that consensus that's needed. But I think that the Scottish example is encouraging in that respect.
Teresa?
Yeah. Through the chair, I think you're absolutely right. There are important differences with Scotland, I mean, as well as similarities, because in Scotland, some of the educational and health services that are delivered through the centre are delivered through local government. But we have important advantages as well in that some of the documents I've mentioned, because I think one of the strengths of Scotland is the review that they've undertaken, because they have made huge strides forward, but they've continually reviewed their progress. And I suppose what I was drawing attention to was the scrutiny and challenge that comes from the centre, because obviously a committee like this is hugely important in terms of making sure things are on track, scrutinising and challenging, as our elected members in councils do. But we have an important advantage in that Scotland is trying to bring its health and social care together. They're separate. And I know from reading recent documentation, that's something they're struggling with. Now, we're starting off from a point where we already have that system in place. So I think, yes, we are, it's not totally like with like, but we're in a good place as well with the reform of local government. Additional powers are being delegated now to local government. Planning is a massive issue, and the timing of the work that has been done here has been drawn to the attention of elected members. Couldn't be better, because there is massive change about to happen in local government. And yes, we do raise most of the money through our rates to pay for local services, but we're also getting a significant amount coming from the centre now to fund planning. So, you know, there is a change there, and there's an opportunity within that change, I think, to look at some of these issues, and for you as members to decide, is there something in this that you want to take forward?
And I think in one way you actually answered your own question very eloquently, in that, you know, on paper it looks as if a single system type government that exists in Scotland should be easier. They'd be the first to say it was very challenging. Here, and we've said it all along, we know we're in a different set of circumstances. You mentioned there about some of the hows, and that's the next piece. Trying to build up the next steps. What is it we need to do to introduce this sort of approach? And indeed, in itself, it may be part of the piece about creating a common ground and a bit of a shared dialogue and narrative. That's what actually would help in terms of some of the conversations that the executive need to have over the next year.
I mean, I accept that the chair that, I mean, it's literally from I was elected and arrived here in 2007, government and everybody has talked about things like early intervention and the bit, but we've seen precious little of us being able to deliver that. And I'm not even being critical of individual ministers in that I think sometimes individual ministers can be very well intentioned, but probably themselves get frustrated at the lack of pace, or how do they pull all these things together, whether that's to deal with mental health, with suicide, with much earlier interventions, educational underachievement, whatever it happens to be. But there's probably a frustration in how they pull that together and make what they want actually happen on the ground. And that's bound to be certainly very frustrating for me as a backbencher, never mind those that are ministers. And that's how do we, getting from a point of writing a very highbrow programme for government to something that means and is outcomes focused. And we do have an great opportunity, because we are, you know, I suppose about 15, 16 months out from being in the position in the Assembly that we will be writing our next programme for government.
And I think early intervention is a really good example, because part of the current dilemma we face is short and medium term planning, and this is long term, and that's 15 years before you'll see the impact of some of the investment in early intervention. And that's where the courage piece comes in, that people have to trust, and that's what Scotland are finding 7 years in. The early intervention, particularly in the children and young people sphere, is starting to impact on the other statistics, like crime and suicide, depression, etc. But it's about having the tenacity and patience and courage to accept that it's long term. I mean, we're talking maybe 2 or 3 assemblies away before some of these impacts, so that requires courage on your part as a committee as well, to accept we're not going to get quick wins. Some of this is going to be putting down foundations for improvement over a period of time.
But the win eventually is that if you were upstreaming so much of your activity, your overall cost envelope will fall in a time that we're not expecting huge rises in public expenditure for a very long time to come, that you could make a major impact on that. And that's probably the frustration, probably even for things like the Public Health Agency, that they are, you know, you're looking at a longer term thing and building in that to have a sustainable health system 20 years from now.
That's right. And indeed, the Building Better Lives document was one that we took particular cognizance of when we were looking at the performance framework that we're suggesting, because there's been some really good work done by the Public Health Agency exactly on that premise. And I think they've highlighted some of the best practice around the province. And it's now about, you know, getting... I actually think people want to do this, and it's the trick now for us is to get the how. And to have the reality check that this isn't going to be quick wins. It is going to be about government working in different ways. But there will be, I think there will be gains, undoubtedly, and maybe more quickly than we think.
Thanks, Chair.
Michaela?
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you for the information you've given us, and we welcome the report. A couple of things, I tend to agree with John about the slow pace of things in terms of how we can assist here. But I think one thing, and I know, Aidan, you'll understand where I'm coming from when I ask this, if we're to ensure that the approach to well-being tackles social inclusion, will it be rural-proofed? You understand why I'm asking that, and I'll give you a slight example of that in terms of your Equal Opportunities Committee, and I suppose around increasing the proportion of young people in learning and training and work. And one issue that I had to deal with in the constituency on Friday, and I don't want to ramble on, but it's just the issue in terms of how we need investment for us to change policies to get these outcomes. A young male who left school very early, literacy, numeracy problems, and is now in the steps to success training. And obviously the area, as you know, and that's why I asked, has it been rural-proofed? A young person from the Burndennett area, and you would know that, who is travelling to the Southwest College to take part in he's looking to be a mechanic. And just, it's his passion, and that's what he wants to do. But obviously because of our policy here, and he is on that low income bracket, the assistance he gets to go to the Southwest College just entitles him to get a bus from A to B. But he lives further 10 mile out, and the small assistance he gets goes towards all of his transport costs. So it doesn't give him any incentive to be doing that work at the college, work that he wants to do. So he does feel socially excluded along with his peers and others around him. So I think just that's why I'm asking, if we want this to work, it has to be rural-proof right across, and how we can help assist you in doing that. And I know we're going through the changes in council, and that will be at their door, I'm sure, a lot of this as well. But and again, we could talk all day about this. Is an issue all of these I would be passionate about. We have a lot of transgenerational issues, and I know a lot of this will go a long way in assisting those issues. But just, I know this is exclusive report to the north here, but see, in terms what potential exists for an island-wide approach to well-being, and can data be harmonised north and south, and is that something maybe further down the road that you will be looking to expand? I know you have particularly looked at the Scottish model, but will there be any work north and south?
And on the first point, I think what you've done is very ably put into perspective what we're talking about, what the individual experience someone has.
The impact on the ground.
Exactly, and I mean that's what we should never forget. That's the touchstone, because that's why we're all here, to try and see what you would do, how you would take that issue, look at the system, see where the things aren't working, and that's what they've done in Scotland, at trying to turn things on its head and start with the people at the bottom. So that's what we would try and encourage. It's not easy to do, and there's multiple players from local government right through FE, HE, transport, rural issues, Department of Agriculture. Even just using that example, you can see the complexity of this approach, but it's the one that would make the difference if we can get it right.
Someone's life, how that would change.
And that's what we're talking about, societal well-being. It's about actually helping that young man do what he wants to do as best we can. It'll take a while to get the thing right, but if we have some successes,
and obviously funding will have to follow that.
Absolutely,
that's be the major.
Absolutely, and that's what so there's a complexity to it, but it's the human example. In terms of the north-south, the work has been done. John, do you want to pick that one up?
To mention something about the north-south. I'll just quickly add to your bit about the rural-proofing point. Something we learnt in Scotland about their approach. They talked about the work being people-focused and place-based, and I think that's something that we very much take on board, that a holistic approach to well-being is about people and how it impacts on them. So how does it impact on that young man? And that has to be read across or through the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, and does it have an impact or a result for him? So it's about people, but it's about place, it's about where he lives and the community he lives in. And that, of course, is what community planning is all about. So that well-being can manifest itself through the place that I live in, the relationships I have with the people I live with and work with, and the community that I'm in. And I think that's where we see it working out. And if we do it well, it should have results.
Yeah, and it's put the infrastructure as well in place
course,
to help that.
all those elements, yeah.
Before Teresa's just going to add, and then you come back.
No, I just want to make the point, I know in the community planning partnerships, further education colleges, just on that specific example, really are extremely committed. And I know at a meeting last week with some of the chief executives of the further education colleges with the Del Minister, Farry, and they are very, very keen to be very involved from the earliest point. But I think just going back to the Scottish model, I mean, one of the important things about the way funding has followed the outcomes, what we were hearing when we spoke to our colleagues in Scotland was, unless agencies can point to the outcomes that they're contributing to, they don't get funded. So, you know, it becomes a really important mechanism for ensuring that the outcomes that, you know, executive members want to see being delivered, that's where the money actually goes. And I think that's where the sort of the era of duplication and sort of putting in a service because it's a good idea, I mean, it squeezes all that out so that the outcomes become the thing that everybody becomes concentrated on. And if that outcome, which obviously social inclusion is a critical issue for all of us, and as you mentioned, rural proofing as well, and early years was mentioned, if those are the areas that, you know, we should all be concentrating on, then that's where the money has to go. And I think that's one of the strengths of the approach, certainly from my perspective.
Yeah, just finally on that point, in terms of inclusion, part of I suppose the story around a societal well-being approach and I suppose going beyond aggregate measures that often lose out on the detail and texture of those stories that you're talking about. The international evidence that we have taken on board suggests that unless communities are involved in the design of indicators, outcomes, unless we're, we need to be capturing the narrative as well as the statistics. So that's part of the piece when we talk about this contributing to a new culture where communities are enabled to engage in a much more comprehensive way with policy and outcomes. This is part of our expectation, our hope around this agenda. Just on the cross-jurisdiction issue, we actually had one of the leading experts in the wellbeing field from the Republic of Ireland, Helen Johnson, sit on the round table, and she's been a very active participant in the round table. And you're absolutely right. There has been a parallel conversation around wellbeing and governance in the Republic of Ireland. There's much to learn, and one of the areas that Helen drew attention to were certain methodologies that they've actually pioneered around community participation, community conversations. How do those conversations effectively contribute to government outcomes? Finally, just on a more generic, part of a more generic response to your question, I think it's important always, and I think it's a blatantly obvious point, but I'll make it anyway, that outcomes can never, as a region, we can never be in control of all of the influences on an outcome. So there's always, there are global factors involved, and there are cross-jurisdictional, and then there's the devolved piece as well. So the cross-jurisdiction piece has to be there as well, has to be explicit in any framework in this particular context.
And indeed, we drew on, there was a major study in 2009 on Ireland, the Social Report on Ireland Wellbeing Matters by the National Economic and Social Council, which we've drawn on. And interestingly, in 2013, they introduced a subjective wellbeing measure into their national household survey. So they've started as well as a measure to start introducing wellbeing measures into their political system. So we've been looking at all that sort of practice in terms of our own deliberations as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
To the Chair.
Thanks very much, Chair. Good morning. Yeah, I find it very interesting what you have outlined in the report, and I think it was Di Valera who said that all he had to do was look into his own heart to find out what the Irish people needed. So you wouldn't describe that as an objective needs-based model, I'm sure. But you did say, Peter, that the Scottish ministers, you said we know what needs to be done, but we're just not doing it. So what I want to ask you, when they said they knew what needed to be done, was that knowledge based on the sort of Di Valera type heart searching, or was there some objective means of establishing what the needs were upon which the policies would be based? And I suppose if you have an objective, let's say, list of needs, you then have to prioritise them, because some needs might be more important or more urgent than others. Do they do that? We also know from our experience here that some of the outcomes which happen here are perhaps a result of lobbying by various sectors of society, and I'm not saying that the outcomes are not needed, but they may not be what's most needed. So how do they, in Scotland, what influence do lobbyists have, whether they're from the third sector, business or wherever, and how do you ensure that the outcomes are the ones which are most needed and which need to be prioritised? Just on the the use of the graphs, there, statistics, and the the tracking of there's the old expression, lies, damn lies, and statistics, and I know from my own experience, I've met people high up in the health trust at various stages, and I'm complaining about some aspect of the service which, in the experience of the end users, is far from satisfactory. And the official, will say, well, look, we've met our targets every month for the last 18 months, but there's a discrepancy between, the meeting of the targets and what the end users experience on the ground. So how do you ensure that, these indicators or these tracks here, or trackings, that they are a faithful representation of what's actually happening? Thanks.
It's knowing where to start, because every one of those questions is exactly what some of it we still need to find the answers on. I don't know if any colleagues want to pick up on any in particular. To start with, Peter, do you want to go ahead?
Within the one of our friends in the Department of Justice uses this phrase. It's what we need. What we know is that we need to start stopping and preventing people falling into the river, rather than spending money rescuing them, when they've fallen in. And the frustration there is that the knowledge, which was evident in Scotland as well, but it's here as well. There's a real desire to respond to this. That if an effective, cost-effective, as well as a humanitarian approach is to be pursued, that you've got to work at the front end of the problem. That the justice system is constantly picking up on the fallout from people's lives who have not been well served, at other points in their lives, whether it's education, training, early years, support for mental health. The Justice Department is not the place to support people who have mental health difficulties, and yet it's full of people who need that kind of support, whether it's addiction or mental health. So it's in that sense that the frustration and that comes from inside drove change in Scotland. And the change was not simply about data and writing another report and making these points. It was linking the desire for a change in focus to reorganisation, shifting the culture, unleashing, liberating the doers in the various departments and their partners beyond departments, liberating, providing the cues, the mandates and the authority to work together, to reimagine the problem as well as get new solutions. So it's in that sense that disconnect has driven some of the change. Can I just say one thing as well? The point around lobbying, part of the piece here is to try and enshrine an evidence-based approach to policy, to get more transparency about why certain trade-offs are being made, why certain decisions are being made, and also raising the ability of actors beyond government to engage in that debate, to provide a platform for them to do so, so that the lobbying piece begins to be exposed.
Yeah.
If it's leading to poor outcomes.
And there also needs to be, an acceptance in the broader body politic that that's the way to go. That if the greatest need is at this point and the greatest priority is at this point, well then, as you say, that's where the bulk of the funding should go. And it means that other stakeholders in society have to be prepared to put their particular needs or the fulfilment of their needs on hold until a more urgent one is dealt with.
And indeed, we heard evidence, interestingly, through the round table itself. We obviously went to Scotland for the visit, but then, tested some of the evidence, and through one of our contacts, heard on the issue, for example, of domestic violence. Some of the charities associated with domestic violence weren't happy because they felt they'd lost out, but also saw the benefit of the investment in children and young people services, so recognised that the reality. So you're quite right, there will be lobbyists for particular issues, and rightly so, that's what they're there for. But there's a maturity required about it's not everything we can do. Teresa was going to say something.
I just wanted to make a point about the statistics. I mean, absolutely agree. There's a lot of information around. I'm sure you're bombarded, and at times making sense of it can be quite difficult. But I think one of the opportunities that we now have with an outcomes-based approach is the joining up of different bits of information to make sense of, as you very eloquently put it, that person who you meet, your constituent, they don't care, about the silos. They're not interested. What they want to know is about the service that's being provided to them. And we've had this conversation in the round table. I mean, my background, I've had a justice background as well, and working for the Legal Services Commission. And one of the things that struck me, and I've also a family and childcare background, is there is a link between the children coming into the care system and our legal aid spend. But the departments don't join those, and it's left to yourselves to make those linkages when the people come before you. And I think that that's what the outcomes-based approach forces key officers and key officials to start looking at their data and joining it up to make sense of that end-user experience. And the other thing I just wanted to say, the other thing that happens, I think, in this outcomes-based approach is the fluidity of spend, and it sort of hits the point as well about the rural example we heard. One of the people I was speaking to recently was the Chief Constable who worked in Scotland. I don't want to misquote him now, but he was very impressed with the community planning and the Scottish approach, and he made the point that the spend in the community planning partnership that he was part of, the police found themselves being funded by health, because what it meant was that if they were in Sauchiehall Street in Glasgow on a Saturday night, policing and very heavily, that there were fewer than casualties hitting the Glasgow Infirmary. So it's that joining up of thinking and of funding which can produce good outcomes for all the services and for our service users.
Yeah.
So just on you asked how the Scottish ministers were able to say we know what needs to be done. I can't really answer for them, but just thinking of our situation and how things have developed, there's an initiative of creation of what works centres by the UK government level and spreading across all jurisdictions where the evidence for policy is being gathered and quite simply what works and how can we share that knowledge across the piece. And so that's one sort of valuable way of addressing that. The other question about how is that then prioritised? Well, in the report, we do look at some different methodologies that could move us away from conventional cost-benefit analysis, that could bring in, which fails very often to take account of well-being outcomes, and looking at other methodologies of how you would bring in what the ultimate result would be on people's well-being, and also how you deal with the trade-offs that are often necessary when you're making these decisions, and how you actually just recognise that sometimes you have to make a judgment and say, actually, what we want to do is this, because we feel that's more maybe politically important than something else, rather than just saying it's a technical exercise. So we write a bit about that in the report. And then finally on the statistics, are they lies? Well, again, one of some of the evidence we heard was that it's really important to include people and include a discussion with citizens about how they want to measure progress. So what are the indicators that Scotland have got here that they kind of wrote down to start off with, but can we develop indicators that people have actually been involved in developing and therefore they trust them and they will believe what's produced, and then the legitimacy of the whole system becomes rather deeper.
It creates an opportunity for a really good community conversation at, say the 11 local council level to inform then the executive on what's important to people on the ground.
But when you have the information, the statistics, it's important that you act on them. Or in the health service here, we hear all of, quite often, quite frequently about waiting times for emergency departments and so on, and some of them are very good and some of them never seem to get beyond a certain point. So whilst we know that certain areas of the system are not working, we don't seem to be able to take the action to make it work. As you said, as the Scottish people said, we've got to make it work better. Otherwise, the statistics are not of much use.
Some of the thinking, I think, is that the indicators, the results of the indicators allow us then to ask the question why. Why has it moved in that direction? Why has it got better? Why has it got worse? Or why isn't it moving at all? And then to take action on it. But it would also, in terms of that sort of example of a waiting list, yes, I mean, one might have be keen to reduce waiting lists, but actually probably the outcome one is looking for is in what are the health outcomes for people, and that might point policy in a different direction.
But presumably the longer the waiting times,
of course,
the lower the outcome's going to be.
Well, yes, but this would enable the kind of the trade-offs and the discussion to happen perhaps more clearly than they do at the moment.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Adrian.
Thanks, Chair. Basically, what you're saying is that it's back to basics and back to common sense, and I think that's something that we've lost somewhere down the line. I had a conversation with the North Eastern Education Board a wee while back, and I was asking about a transfer as a family background, and they're going to make their child move school and all that because of transport and stuff. But I'll not bore you with all the details. But basically, what he told me was that he dealt in policy and not common sense. And I thought that was something that was seriously wrong in our system somewhere, But it's now the right time to introduce something like this here with our budgetary constraints, and how did the Scottish Parliament marry it up with budget constraints and all that there. I think this would be something really good to do, but I'm not sure when now is the right time to do it or not.
I think one of the dilemmas is that the austerity measures that we're facing here are unprecedented, and something has to happen to test what are priorities, and we feel this is an opportunity to actually help ground that debate. Otherwise, it may continue in a process of ad hocery. We'll continue the silos, will not get outcomes, etc. But it's not going to be easy. And as Teresa said, budgets determine. You need a sound basis on which to say that's the priority. And we feel the development of this framework, for the first time, gives assurance to from local government level right up to central government level that there's a basis on which these choices are being made, and they're not easy choices by any means. And there will be outcries. The Scottish model as well had teething problems, people who were disaffected because their area wasn't a priority. But what I think Scotland, and I stand to be corrected, but my sense of talking to officials over there was that it was hard going at the start, but they actually very quickly saw the advantages of working across the boundaries Teresa's described. And they could see, and we saw it in the teams that were built up across departments, looking at, for example, in Dale, a bit like Justice tends to pick up what is failed down the line in terms of things that was mentioned, literacy and numeracy, what's happening in education, should the priority therefore be there because it's preventative, etc., etc. It allows the forum for those debates, which I think a lot of people, it's the common sense piece, I think everybody actually knows. The point is Scotland knew, they said we know what needs to be done, but the hard discussion was, what do we do about it? So I think that, and then the budget follows. The hard decision is going to be, for Northern Ireland, what is the compelling narrative that people here want to see for the vision going forward for this place in the next 15 to 20 years, and starting that conversation so that you as elected members and your electorates feel, haven't been able to do everything, but for Northern Ireland these are the key things. And I think cross-party, it's possible to have those conversations as well, because a lot of the issues are about the human issues that you're facing on the ground in your constituencies. Not easy, but I think we have an unprecedented opportunity to actually change that conversation. And there's a robust, the good thing is there's a robust body of evidence that we've managed to gather globally, from everything from OECD down to work done here locally. We mentioned PHA already. That we can actually help shore up the conversation with some of the evidence base and the suggested statistical background. You're going to need the assurance of a good, solid system, and there's going to have to be mechanisms, there's going to have to be training and development, awareness raising with elected members, and understanding of the measures and what's been brought in. So there's a capacity building piece that needs to happen as well. We're not just saying overnight, here's your framework and away you go. It actually has to be a process where people understand it as they go along, so that when you're getting this evidence and you're saying that housing needs going up here, why? And then you're able to say and it wouldn't just be the housing executive who would be in here, it would be health or the other associated department, that so you'll be getting a collective reporting out. And I think that's a change as well, that people accept responsibility for the part they play.
What you're saying there is that the PCSP is not trying to do something like that there, and it hasn't really worked there the way it should be working. And this was sort of the same sort of frame of model, but it's bigger.
It is, and building on some of that has worked. Some of that work has worked well, but not all.
Not the way it should have worked, really. Not the way we envisaged it.
And maybe the context. Sometimes things of its time, and maybe it's moving towards that.
Yeah, through the chair, I do think the point you're making is absolutely right, that what is required is a culture change. And I think that's what we're hearing from members in this committee today, and I think that's what we would all agree on. It is a culture change, but it is a citizen-focused approach, and it is very much what community planning is about. It is focusing on the citizen, and then it's joining through the single outcome agreement, if that's the way the executive decides to go, right through into the programme for government that this is, and is joined right into the heart of government in a way that haven't been.
Can I just add one point? The financial climate is an interesting background for this conversation. There's a report by an organisation called Vanguard. No local resonant, no local reference. But it was conducted by a systems thinker, someone who understands that you can't reduce a problem to its its component parts. You've got to look at it within the bigger context. And the findings are striking, because the study, which was based in England of the public services, showed that virtually all of the increasing demand on public services is coming from is resulting from poor decision making within the public sector itself. So the cost of not actually shifting the way we do things is phenomenal. So there's an economic story here as well in terms of the benefits as well as outcomes for citizens.
I think we need to get that story out, the two messages going out at one well rather than just one message, because I think that could be used as an obstacle. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, members. All right, fascinating stuff, and we'll see you again in 2 months' time, I think, for the report.
And thank you for your interest. It's very much appreciated by the Roundtable, because that has given us a real sense of the value of this work. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oops, I'm cold.
Okay, members, we're going to move straight into the next evidence on the Barnett formula. I refer members to terms of reference for the committee review at page 54 of your pack, biographical note on Dr. Gudgeon at page 55, and a briefing paper from Dr. Gudgeon at pages 6 to 15. Morning.
Good morning.
Dr. Gudgeon, do you want to make some opening comments on your paper, and then we'll move straight to questions from members?
Okay. Thanks, Chairman. Can I just ask who's seen the paper? Has it been circulated?
Yes.
That's all right. The main point I'd like to make in the paper is that there has been a Barnett squeeze, i.e. Northern Ireland's share of all Barnett relevant UK expenditure per head was coming down for various reasons explained in the paper. But over the last 4 years, during a period of national expenditure cuts, the proportion has been rising again. And I think we can expect that to continue after the election, particularly if the coalition is re-elected. But really, almost irrespective of who gets elected, there will be continuing public expenditure cuts. And therefore, Northern Ireland's share of Barnett expenditure is likely to rise. It's currently 30%, and may rise above that. So worries about the Barnett squeeze, I think, for the foreseeable future, for the next few years, are probably beside the point. The other main thing to say is that I know in Northern Ireland there are occasionally complaints about or ill feeling about the Barnett formula, and some suggestions that it should be replaced. My suggestion is that Northern Ireland would do well, I think, to keep quiet about the Barnett formula. I think any replacement, particularly if it's a more needs-based replacement, is probably going to be to the detriment of the Northern Ireland bloc. Now, that may change after 5 years or so, but in the next few years of national context of expenditure cuts, that would Barnett will probably serve us quite well, and particularly if the health and education budgets are ring-fenced. Again, that's been a benefit to Northern Ireland. I don't think I made that point in the paper, but I'll make it now. In some cases, I think we can understand higher expenditure in Northern Ireland, particularly in education, one or two other things, but in other programmes, including health, I would find it hard to justify the difference in expenditure per head between Northern Ireland and England. And it's for that reason it might be to Northern Ireland's advantage to keep fairly quiet. The other thing, point out in the paper, is that about a third of the money that comes into Northern Ireland from Westminster doesn't come in through the Barnett formula, but comes in mainly through demand-led social security and pensions payments, and they are also pretty high. Pension payments are about 30% higher than England, particularly for any benefits related to invalidity. So that includes DLA, carers allowance, tenants allowance, and ESA and incapacity benefit. And I've suggested a few reasons there why those might be higher. But once again, I think if there was any poking about into that by the Treasury, it might not help Northern Ireland. The estimate here is that Northern Ireland gains about £1 billion a year from having higher benefits levels than per head than England. That's a lot of money, and it's far bigger than the cuts to the block that have been discussed in relation to corporation tax, for instance. And just two final points I'll perhaps make, Chairman. Firstly, is I think there's some evidence, or at least reason, to believe that a high subvention and fairly generous funding of Northern Ireland probably takes away pressure for public sector reforms. That's something which I think a DFP committee should reflect on. If those reforms are made, then it means you can spend less money on some programmes, leaving more money for others. That, of course, doesn't follow for social security. Any money that we saved in social security in Northern Ireland would be a loss to Northern Ireland. And therefore, there's a perverse incentive, I think, to have social security spending reasonably high in Northern Ireland. My final points were on corporation tax, which is something I've worked on in the past with my colleague, Professor Neil Gibson, who I think some of you will know. And so a couple of points to make here is that the deductions to the Barnett formula consequent on devolving corporation tax I think are still to be finally agreed. But I make the point that I think DFP, and I think DFP would agree with this, DFP officials aren't in a good place, in a strong position really to negotiate a good deal for Northern Ireland here. So really it's up to the politicians. And of course we wait to see what happens in the forthcoming election and how strong Northern Ireland's hand will be. But having been involved myself in some negotiations with the Treasury over corporation tax, I think they really do, to use a Northern Ireland term, they do put their arm in over this. And in particular, they've refused to include in the calculation any increase in taxes like income tax and VAT that may rise in Northern Ireland as a result of us getting more activity. And I think that's something that Northern Ireland politicians should certainly take up when and where they can with Treasury ministers. Yes, my final point is the deduction from the block at present. I think what's been talked about is a figure of something around 300 million. And that's pretty well what would be the windfall gain to existing companies in Northern Ireland, including existing small companies that might incorporate as a result to get a lower rate of tax. And it's always been my view that Northern Ireland should consider recouping that windfall gain through other taxes, like, for instance, business rates. It's really £300 million into the pockets of existing companies and the shareholders of those companies. Some of the shareholders of those companies, of course, are outside Northern Ireland as well, but they would all gain as a windfall, even if they do nothing. The point of lower corporation tax is to attract new companies into Northern Ireland, especially new high-paying companies the Googles and the Microsofts of this world. And not just to put money into the pockets of already reasonably affluent people. So I think those are the main points, Chairman.
Thank you very much.
To take questions on those or other issues.
I mean, in terms of the Barnard formula, and you made reference to the fact that the status quo is beneficial to ourselves. But is the case now that, you know, in the next year, next 2 years, the status quo is going to be washed away, essentially? I mean, the most recent polls are showing that the SNP and Labour are more likely to form a majority within Westminster. And of course, all that can change in the next few months. But given, you know, that fact and the fact that Scotland are now getting the Crown Estate, they're getting air passenger duty, we're getting corporation tax, you know, those inconsistencies, how long can they stay in place before, you know, we get APD and Scotland get corporation tax? And all of that will certainly upset the financial apple cart, the financial levers status quo that has existed up to now. And how can Barnett remain in place given those facts? I mean, you made the point as well that corporation tax, does it really make sense for us to have corporation tax and not be able to reap the benefits in terms of income tax and VAT as well? So perhaps Pandora's box has been opened to a certain degree. So in terms of that changing situation politically, how do you see things playing out, and what risks are there, but also what benefits is there of that changing situation? Because there's often reference made to the subvention that the North gets, but if we were to have more financial levers to set our own tax rates, would we also be in a position to generate more revenue to offset what is referred to as a subvention?
Yes, no, it's a good point, and any answer is a matter of political judgment. I think, you know, others are in as good a position as myself to comment. But I would say I think we're in a very strange transitional period. First thing to say is that part of the agreement with Scotland was that Barnett would be continued. That was, to me, a rather unexpected hostage to fortune. You know, I don't know, you know, how seriously that will be taken, but it did seem to imply Barnett would continue for the foreseeable future. And I think the Scots will complain bitterly if that's overturned. And if the Scots are in government, then it won't be overturned. I think we could probably say. But we are in a fairly unstable position. I mean, it wouldn't be a surprise to me, for instance, if Scotland was to leave the UK within the next 10 years, particularly if the SNP form part of a coalition, they can negotiate changes to their benefit, and their presence would annoy English voters who already, I know from my own discussions in England, are quite annoyed by some of the things that have happened. So I think we are in something of a transitional period, that there will be changes. But I would say, I think Northern Ireland's been, of the devolved governments, has been the intelligent one over taxes. And if Scotland has been pushing for more income tax devolution for a long time, I don't think that helps them in the slightest. They've had, as we know, they've had some devolution of income tax for quite a long time. They've never used it. It's a very hard thing to use, you know, if you put it down, it's going to annoy the English tremendously. If you put it up, it's going to annoy your own voters in Scotland. So the easiest thing is to leave it where it is, and that's what an SNP government have done. Now, with more powers on income tax, still my expectation would be that probably only little changes at the margins. Really not very big changes. So I think Northern Ireland has come very well out of this as the only devolved region to ask for and get corporation tax, which in my mind is the one that really makes the economic difference. It's the one that attracts companies. It's the tax that multinational companies across the world are looking at. You know, if they consider Northern Ireland or the Republic of Ireland, they say, well, what's the corporation tax and what are the tax rules? So Northern Ireland, I think, has been ahead of the game here. But you're quite right, Chairman, I think, to say that Scotland will be pushing for this, and indeed have been. I did give evidence a couple of years ago to the Scottish Parliament Finance Committees similar to today. And I said, in my view, it was unthinkable that a coalition government would devolve corporation tax to Scotland, which is a view I'd formed talking to English ministers. And there was immediate pandemonium in the room. They said they were in negotiations with the Treasury, and was the Treasury negotiating in bad faith? I didn't know that, but it was interesting that they did think they were in serious negotiations on corporation tax. But in the end, I was right. They didn't get it. But if the SNP are in a coalition government at Westminster, then I think we could expect that would be one thing they would push for. Yes. So unstable, uncertain situation. But I'd still repeat my opening remarks. I think Northern Ireland might do well to keep its head down in a certain world.
Okay, move to questions. Judith?
Thank you, Chair. I wasn't quite ready for that. I was still jotting down some notes there. Can I ask you just in relation to some of the comparative spending, that we've said that there's a higher per capita spending in all areas apart from science and technology, which is probably an area that we should actually be investing more in, given the the growth aspect for the economy out of that. What do you see the underlying reasons being for that? Is it like, for instance, in health, we're mirroring a lot of the structures that they've got in GB from an administrative point of view, and we've got much smaller numbers of people to deal with, and actually could potentially have one body for the 5 that are currently in place. And I think you mentioned as well, that by continuing to fund us the way that we are, there's a disincentive for us actually to reform and make those improvements. Are there other issues as well?
No, that's right. I mean, I know other witnesses in previous sessions have described the Barnett formula as something of a mess and a mystery that we've inherited from history. So when it was set up in 1979, Northern Ireland at that point, for various reasons, had a high level of public expenditure. And although the Barnett squeeze took that down for a long time, it's remained high. So it's not, in a sense, anything anybody has necessarily intended or designed. It's certainly not been a transparent policy to have higher expenditure in Northern Ireland. It's just an inherited position that has been somewhat eroded, but is now going the other way. So we have more money per head in Northern Ireland than people do in England, and therefore it tends to be spent over a range of programmes, nearly all of which are higher. And you're in as good a position as I would be to know why some are perhaps a bit higher than others. But all the devolved governments, for instance, spend a lot more on economic development than is available in England. And having been involved with some of the regional development agencies in England, it really, as a first approximation, I mean, they have no money for the sorts of things that Invest NI do. I mean, derisory amounts of money, really. So there's no support. I don't think that's always realised in Northern Ireland, certainly not by a lot of businessmen here. That, if they were in England, they probably wouldn't be getting anything. And we get a lot of support. It's my view that far too much of that support goes to existing companies, who could quite easily raise the money from other means. But that may take us beyond what you want to discuss today. Sorry, does that answer your question, Judith?
That's fine. Yep.
Okay, Leslie.
Yes. Good. It's just a good question. That is a good morning or good afternoon. High noon. Thank you very much. Sorry I missed the start of your presentation, but following on from the corporation tax and the imminent evolution of it here, you did touch, or come close to touching on this, the UK-wide debate on the devolution of other fiscal powers, and what implication do you see for all of that having on the any developments, any changes to the Barnett consequentials, the Barnett formula itself?
Well, there have to be adjustments. I mean, the Scots are going to get half of income tax devolved, and there will be an adjustment. As far as I know, the details of that adjustment haven't been decided or announced yet. But I think that's the main one. In a sense, it's just a, it's just an adjustment to how the money arrives in Scotland or how it arrives in Northern Ireland. What I would say is I think it's very much a move in the right direction to try and match expenditure with tax raising powers in the devolved regions, including Northern Ireland. It's a very lopsided and I think rather undemocratic situation we've been in for decades, where the money comes from Westminster. It arrives here in Northern Ireland. Essentially, your job as MLAs is just to decide how to spend the money, but there are no real consequences in tax raising. It's a much more democratic position, I think, if every time you decide on an expenditure decision that there's a tax consequence as well. That would make Northern Ireland, for instance, much, it's going in the direction of the Republic of Ireland, which is always seemed to me much more responsible and, if I may use the term, rather more grown up about its fiscal debates. They know if they spend more money, taxes will be...
You don't think that, for example, if several more fiscal powers, and we've talked about all the minor ones as well, stamp duty and all that sort of stuff, that if a lot more were to fall, that the structure of Barnes itself would need to be completely changed? And would that be a Pandora's box?
I think if we're only talking about small adjustments and small taxes, adjustments can be made to Barnet and Barnet can carry on. But if I understand where your question is leading, I mean, if we got to say the devolution of the whole of income tax, for instance, I think that's right. It would start to make Barnet look less important and somewhat irrelevant. And we would be moving then much more towards a more federal UK.
Yeah.
My own personal opinion, for what little it's worth, is that we are on that journey now.
Thank you.
Okay, Michaela.
Thank you, Chair. You're very welcome, Dr. Gudgeon.
Thank you.
There are some concerns that have been raised by other commentators around the lack of transparent or independent public finance data, and you allude to that in your work in modelling the reduced corporation tax rates. In order for this to be addressed, and to provide assurance that any devolution of further fiscal powers is on the basis of a fair and proportionate adjustment to the black grant, how can you develop that? How can that go forward? And also, how do you think we should progress, if at all, with repatriating or revenue streams locally?
Right. First part of your question, it just seemed to me if there was more transparency in the negotiations which go on between DFP civil servants and Treasury civil servants about how much the block would be affected. I mean, if you were to have weekly reports and the Treasury is asking for this and DFP are suggesting less, then you could put your views into this, but I think political pressures could be brought to bear, and it seems to me that those are the important ones. As I said earlier, my own experience of negotiation with the Treasury is that they're tough cookies and they're trying to get the best deal for the Treasury. That's all they're trying to do, and they will load any costs on that they think help them, and they will resist any changes that they think won't help them. So I think transparency is quite important. I mean, I may have missed things, but I'm not quite sure where those negotiations are at present. I'd like to know more about them, and I think it would help Northern Ireland if we knew more. Not necessarily. What I'm really saying there is I'm not sure this is really necessarily a job for civil servants. I mean, they can do some of the initial legwork, but it's a political. In my view, it's quite largely a political decision because it's not cut and dried. There are fairness issues that some people can argue it's fair to include something, and other people can argue that it's fair to exclude. other things. But that's a debate that I think would be rather better in the open. So that was really my point on that. By the way, perhaps I could just add one thing on this. I mean, my experience was that the Treasury, that they tend to involve customs and excise staff in these negotiations, and they know their tax details pretty well, and they're pretty tough on this. But on the other side of it, when it comes to estimating the benefits of corporation tax, which is rather less important but is part of this, my own experience was that the Treasury were just hopeless on it. I mean, they were just off the wall. And we absolutely rejected their calculations. So I don't know if that'll be relevant to you, but if you are faced with any figures that come from the Treasury on the possible economic impact on Northern Ireland of having lower corporation tax, I wouldn't start from the assumption that you're dealing with experts who know what they're doing. It's a strong thing to say, but that was my experience.
Your experience.
Sorry, could you just repeat your second question?
In terms of, do you think we should progress with repatriating revenue streams locally?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure what you mean by repatriating in that case.
What goes to what the Westminster get? How do we get that renovated or repatriated back into our local economy to generate the economy again?
Well, that's essentially what the Barnett. Sorry, revenue streams from here. Yeah, the two aren't related at all. And even the two aren't related even at national level to an extent that would surprise quite a lot of people, which is why we have such a huge public debt, public borrowing. Tax rates are set, money comes in or doesn't come in, governments set their expenditure, but not as closely related to their income. They don't relate their expenditure as closely to their income as perhaps you and I do, and have to. Second thing to say is we don't really know exactly what the tax revenue from Northern Ireland is. I now live largely in England, but when I lived in Northern Ireland, my tax office was always in Liverpool, I think. I don't think it's that easy for the customs and excise to work out exactly what tax is raised in Northern Ireland. That perhaps brings me to another point I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, which is quite important. But the Treasury and the DFP officials are trying to estimate what corporation tax is raised in Northern Ireland, and then Treasury will take that off the block. But it seems to me by far the best thing to do is just to set perhaps a temporary figure, say around about 300 million. But then to let it run for a year in Northern Ireland at the national corporation tax rate and see what money does come in. At present, we don't know. A company like Tesco, for instance, will pay its taxes nationally. We don't know how much of that tax really relates to Northern Ireland. And accountants tell me that's as long as a piece of string anyway. It's very not an easy thing to calculate. So we don't always know what the revenue streams are, and the money we get isn't at all related to the revenue that's raised in Northern Ireland. But currently that's very much to Northern Ireland's benefit, so we might be best just to leave sleeping dogs there.
Let sleeping dogs lie. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Just on that point about revenue streams, I mean, I would say there's within the union there's three devolved institutions. There's lots of finances going to and from. And taxation, but you look at Germany, you look at other countries. Do they have similar problems in terms of financial data? That the figures should be there, they should be transparent. You should be able to trace taxation from source to Treasury. Is there similar problems in other countries, or is it something that's very unique?
My impression in former federations like Germany or Canada that there aren't those problems, but I don't claim to be an expert on those countries, so I'd be open to correction on that. But it seems to me, from what I read, that it all goes much more smoothly than it does in the UK.
So there's a systemic problem here that Perhaps
it's,
could be.
We have a very odd constitutional setup, which is derived from history and has been patched up over time, and that's different from when you start from setting up a federation and the powers of the federal authorities are very clear, the tax-raising powers and their expenditure. And nothing is terribly clear. I mean, the Barnett formula, my understanding, is not a legal requirement. It can be changed, and the detailed rules within Barnett, I think, are sort of fiddled about with every year. It's just an administrative convenience, and therefore obviously open to question and an argument.
Just, in terms of the Barnett formula itself, obviously there's a number of Barnett consequentials year in, year out, and it's very widely open to interpretation as to what is a Barnett consequential and what is not. Is that something that you feel should be passed to a neutral regulator as opposed to being a central government decision?
Yes, I think so. It seems to me most of the decisions that have been made are reasonably sensible, and the devolved civil servants can make their representations, and there is genuine bargaining, I think. But again, I think it would be more transparent and therefore better if there was some sort of independent regulator or a committee on which the devolved authorities sat. But whether it would make very much difference to the finances of Northern Ireland, I'd be less sure. I doubt it's a big issue, but on the other hand, it's important that justice is seen to be done as well as being done.
Okay, Deputy Chair.
Thanks, Chair. Afternoon, Professor. Could I just ask you...
Thanks for the promotion, by the way.
Sorry.
No.
I ask you about the factors that might influence the Barnett formula in the future. For example, what might the implications be for English votes for English laws and the possibility, as you said earlier, of further devolution to the English regions?
I can answer the last bit quite quickly. I don't think there's any possibility of devolution to English regions. There might be some possibility of passing more expenditures back to counties, for instance. But for my sins, I was on the John Prescott's Labour Party Commission on regional government that took evidence in different regions across England, and I would describe it as a fiasco. Absolutely no one in England was interested in regional government. And you will remember that they did actually run a referendum in the North East at one point, which I think got, I can't remember what, it got some derisory vote, 10% or something. But so I don't think any government, English government, will go anywhere near trying to set up a regional tier. But on the other hand, I think the best solution in my mind to the whole issue of English votes for English issues, which does exercise ordinary people as well as politicians in England, would be to pass more of the expenditure of, say, health and education back down to counties, because England is still a greatly over-centralised economic entity, particularly in contrast to the federal systems we were just mentioning. It's interesting, I was at a seminar in Cambridge last week, which I thought was going to be on the breakup of the UK, but rather, as you get in the national press, the only thing people wanted to talk about was English votes for English issues. So I think there will be political pressures there and there will be more changes. But since the coalition government seems to have set the continuation of the Barnett formula in stone, and yet they're essentially facing quite a lot of pressure from English constituencies to change it. We're in the world of immovable objects and irresistible forces. I think it's very hard to know what would come out of that. But it is, I think, I think we are in some constitutional turbulence in which the Barnett formula is very much sitting there as a target. but again, to repeat perhaps for the third time, I think that Northern Ireland's interest is to defend the Barnett formula, I think, rather than ask for its replacement.
Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay.
And therefore, there may not therefore be a common interest between Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, which is a pity, because working together they're quite a strong force.
Okay, Adrian.
Chair, I think my question has been mainly answered here. I just want to say that, summarise what you're saying is that the Barnett formula is the best way forward at this moment in time for us here.
I think so. For the next 5 years or so,
Yeah.
during a period of austerity.
Yeah, well, after the 5 years, can you see after that then, look into your crystal ball and give us a prediction after that?
Depends how much of the present coalition's austerity is actually carried into practice. When I look at the figures, as other economists do, it looks fairly startling, really, to take expenditure levels, and particularly levels of public sector employment, back down to the levels of the 1950s. If they were to do that, I think there could well then be a reaction, and then we might go into a period of faster growth of public expenditure. But I think this coalition has found it rather hard to actually bring in the cuts that they previously announced. There's always sort of backsliding on them, so I wouldn't be surprised if we experience fewer cuts than the government is currently intending. And I think the public debt, even in 5 years, will still be reasonably high. So I can't see us going back to this sort of situation we were in under the last the Blair and Brown Labour governments, in which public expenditure was rising pretty rapidly. So I don't think we'll get back into that. Well, I may not be around to see it.
We'll bring you back in 5 years and see if you're right.
I may be here in 5 years, but not much beyond that. We'll see.
Okay, John.
And thanks, Chair. Sorry for missing some of your presentation, Graham. It's interesting even tying in on to Adrian's point. I mean, we were supposed to be, original coalition projecting we were almost to be at a balanced budget at this point, and it's still, what, 95 or 98 billion in the red. So, I mean, lifting your basic point on that is that you mightn't expect the cuts to be as dramatic, but we're a long number of years away from huge rises in public expending that we had, say, between 2000 and 2010, 12, in the first decade of the century. We bit round the convergence. You're saying there that Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland mightn't just be in agreement round Barn, because the Welsh seem to be having more or less hit conversion. They're suffering slightly under Barn. Do you think will we get to that point at some point if we didn't change the system, or are we a long way from that?
My estimates are we're quite a long way above. I mean, Jerry Holtham, who did the Welsh report, he estimated that our needs in Northern Ireland were about 23% above England. Our current expenditure is about 30%, so we'd be quite well above our need. I wouldn't have done the exercise in the way he did, and I mean, I wonder whether our needs are probably closer to Wales, which are about 14% above England. But let's say our needs are somewhere in that range, between 14 and 23% above England, but the expenditure we're getting is 30% higher. So we're still probably getting quite a lot above need.
So,
but not, if I may add, I think it's politically quite important to add that our excess probably wouldn't be as much as Scotland. Scotland doesn't get as much money as us per head, but their needs are clearly very much lower, and they've got plenty of money, which is why they can spend it, why they can have better arrangements on elderly care, and why they can have more police per head, and student grants, and all the rest of it. I mean, they really have a lot more free money to spend than England.
But that also brings pressure on the wider context of the Union in an English setup. It might be very well for us to say if we're sitting at 30% of the relative spend, you know, probably the best advice is to keep your head down and be quiet about it. I mean, I'm probably finding some of the budget debates that we do sound at times very ungrateful for the fact that our fellow UK citizens are propping us up to such an extent, which, you know, rather than probably being ungrateful, we should be saying thank you very much, because that's, you know, Northern Ireland could not survive the type of cuts you would, even to manage on pulling that figure of 30% back to 23%, never mind if your figure, if your guesstimate was right at 14%, that would have a huge impact. And some of the comments to other questions, say around the federal system, it maybe is much clearer, at least in the federal system, because effectively written down who's doing what and what's the spend and your ability to raise taxes. I mean, the minute we effectively, this assembly only raises regional rate, which I don't know, 5 or 6% of what we spend. You know, it's just a tiny. The idea that we are a low tax assembly, I think, is total nonsense, because we're effectively, we don't have any powers and don't show any willingness to look at revenue raising if pressure come on that. But do you think, well, pressure from England looking at particularly Scotland and Northern Ireland eventually bubble up and keep on going with, you'd mentioned you don't think English regions will get the ball, but would there be a case for some of the bigger cities, like London's making a case for certain powers, Birmingham, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle? Could you see that happening, and a certain level of tax been allowed to be raised under that model?
Yeah, it's certainly there's interesting discussion about evolving things to back to conurbations. Manchester's been quite clever. Manchester's covered, I think, by 9 different local authority districts, there used to be a Greater Manchester Authority that was abolished by Mrs Thatcher, I think, and then, you know, a bit like London, it's then run by 9 different authorities. But they work together pretty well. And it's them that's been pushing harder than anybody else to say, look, give us more of our own money back and we'll decide how to spend it. And because they've shown they can work together pretty well, you know, I think it's taken somewhat seriously. Your question about being grateful, I mean, I sometimes do that for a joke. If friends of mine in England complain about how much money there is in Northern Ireland, I would say, well, thank you very much, we're very grateful. You know? But it's one of the perverse incentives, that's the trouble. You know, I mean, if you were to show gratitude, it would merely attract attention to the fact. And what happens is that Scotland seems to attract much more opposition and antagonism in England than Northern Ireland does. I think Northern Ireland is always treated as a special case, and people don't understand how much repercussions there have been from the Troubles, and a lot of people haven't been here, and it's quite small. Northern Ireland gets under the wire, really, under the radar, but Scotland doesn't. You know.
Well, and I think I accept that, Chad, because it's the whole Scottish, in fact, the entire Scottish referendum debate opened up not only, I suppose, how the UK is funded, but broader governance arrangements, who votes and what rights should you have. If you want this power, you have to take responsibility for it. Whereas Corporation Act, my bit around the funding is we always, even when you look at some of the debate around public sector reform here, the argument is more that we're only doing it because the Tories are making us do it, rather than it's because the right thing to do. You're going to deliver a more efficient model of government or a more efficient public services. You know, whereas we're sort of hooked in this idea that spending is the only answer to our problem. We need to keep spending, and we probably haven't done the same level. I mean, if we'd taken the level of cuts that our colleagues in the Republic of Ireland, we probably would have something to really scream about.
Yes, I don't know if any of you read The Economist magazine, but Professor Neil Gibson was quoted in the current one as describing Northern Ireland as a petulant teenager. Getting used to, you know, to having to take consequences for its spending. I do think that point is pretty important. You know, if the system does fall apart at some point, and in an unstable constitutional position, that's not unthinkable. If it does, you know, I think Northern Ireland is not well placed. It hasn't really put much effort into public sector reform. You know, it has thrown money at problems. You know, you can mention things like the district hospital, Downpatrick Hospital, where I live. You know, I'm not sure that would have been built in an English region. Maybe wrong about that, but you know, there are local pressures for these sort of things, and if we have the money in Northern Ireland, we tend to, you know, you've got the money to respond to those pressures. In some English regions, they just haven't got the money, and they don't respond, and things have to change. I mean, it would be interesting, I think, if you as a DFP committee, were to look at expenditure on different programmes and say, well, how is it that some English regions manage to get by with 20% less per head than we do? You know, what are they actually doing? Mm-hmm. And in some cases, I think they're doing things we wouldn't want to do. A lot of the local cuts in England have actually fallen on local authority care budgets, and that's come back to bite the NHS. I think I know the chief executive of my local hospital in Cambridge, a big teaching hospital, Adam Brooks, he describes himself as running the biggest care home in Europe. You know, there's all his beds are blocked by elderly people who've got nowhere else to go, but he's not doing the job a hospital is there to do. I think that's because the care budgets have been hit so hard.
I mean, that, Chair, becomes, you know, my gripe even and with the previous presentation was that you have no way of making policy whilst transforming your care. Once you hit something difficult, everybody, you know, it becomes a Department of Health policy, not a Northern Ireland government policy. And that's why you have very little room to manoeuvre and to actually drive policy change forward like that under our system. Yeah. That's why it's become so difficult to make any of those actually have almost a strategic approach to doing anything that the government's doing here.
That's right, and that's why it's much better if there can be a balance of income, revenue raising powers and spending powers. You know, in the Republic, the politicians have to live with the consequences of anything they decide, you know, and their own electoral prospects will be heavily influenced by that, which is just not the case in Northern Ireland. You know, it's just not it's a less democratic and sensitive system as a result. But I think we're quite a long way off that. Corporation tax is still a fairly small tax in the scheme of things. But, you know, if the Assembly here could set VAT rates, for instance, and
but certainly the challenge
tax rates, you know, we'd be in a very different world. But I think we're a long way off that. But you know, the system could at some point change quite fast. You know, it's.
Well, the challenge even, and Scotland's looking at a variety of tax varying powers. The challenge is if you got to that point, you make much more realistic decision between what you tax people and what you're spending on.
Well, we'll see if they take advantage of it. I mean, they've had that power. They've had
for 15 years.
They could have raised power, yes. They could have raised income tax rates for a long time, and they haven't.
But then, because of your comment around Barnet in Scotland, they haven't needed to raise extra revenue, or indeed they have decided not to cut income tax.
No, they're quite well placed. But they are doing things at the margin. They're doing doing something on the tax of expensive houses, aren't they, to raise a bit more money. As a fairly left-wing government, you know, you can expect things of that sort happening. But then we'll you know, it's interesting if they do that, because we can see whether that has knock-on consequences for the Scottish economy. And again, we'll be in a world in which there are consequences for these decisions, which I think is a healthier and a more democratic way to run a country. But still, in the UK, we're a long way from having real accountability for spending, and certainly we're a long way from having any tradition of even using the powers that are there. But we'll see what happens in Scotland.
Thanks, Chair.
Okay, John. Okay, members. Dr. Gudgeon, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, members, can I seek agreement to reschedule the family law reform session and also to forward the research paper to DFP for information? Agreed? Okay, members, also on tabled papers, pages 18 to 24, are papers relating to the budget bill and spring supplementary estimates. I can advise members that the accompanying printed documents, including the SSC and vote on account, are available for inspection ahead of an oral briefing by DFP officials next week. Members should remember to bring these documents with them to next week's meeting. Alternatively, the documents can be left with the Secretariat. I can advise members that the various papers are for noting in the meantime. Moving on to subordinate legislation, we're just about a quorum. The Valuation, Telecommunications, Natural Gas and Water Amendment Regs NI 2015. These are pages 58 to 60 of your pack. The purpose of the SRs make provision for the treatment as a single assessment for non-domestic rating purposes, certain properties which would otherwise be treated as several separate assessments. The proposed rule will have the effect of aggregating all site shares on shared telecommunication mast sites into a single rateable assessment, with the host operator or mast owner being responsible for rates on the site. The rule is subject to negative resolution. I can advise members if they have any queries, officials are on standby. Do members have any queries on this? No. Are members content with the proposals? I put the question that the committee has considered DFP's proposal for subordinate legislation under Valuation, Telecommunications, Natural Gas and Water Amendment Regs NI 2015 and has no objection to the policy implications of the proposed legislation at this stage. Agreed? Agreed. Yep. Rates Amendment Regs NI 2015, pages 62 to 63. Purpose is to adjust legislative references and to remove extraneous provision. The adjustments are being made in advance of the reorganisation of local government in April. Subject to negative resolution. Do members have any queries on this? Happy enough. Members content put the question. The committee has considered DFP's proposal for subordinate legislation under the Rates Amendment Regs NI 2015 and has no objection to policy implications of the proposed legislation at this stage. Agreed? Agreed. The Rates Social Sector Value Amendment Regs NI 2015, pages 65 to 67 of your pack. Purpose of this SR is to provide, subject to exceptions, for a person to be chargeable to rates in respect of a domestic property owned by the Housing Executive or a registered housing association listed in Schedule 1 to those regs on the basis of a social sector value rather than on the basis of the property's rateable capital value. DFP is under a duty by virtue of Article 23A2 of the Rates NI Order 1977 to ensure that the amount of rates chargeable is such proportion of any rate payable in respect of the property as the Department considers appropriate. The rule will be subject to negative resolution. Any questions on this one, members? Have enough of that? Okay. Members content with the question. The committee has considered DFP's proposal for subordinate legislation under the Rates Social Sector Value Amendment Regs NI 2015 and has no objection to the policy implications of the proposed legislation at this stage. Agreed? Agreed. Brian, you got off lightly today.
You're looking well.
Moving on, members, correspondence.
Okay, Chair, I'll just pick out a piece of correspondence requiring decisions. At page 70 of the main pack, DFP writing in relation to the business rates, the reval. Some information on the communications process that it's undertaken in terms of communicating to stakeholders and progress. And also there's a draft schedule of values which will allow individual businesses to check their draft values. So it's just members may wish to just note that. There's a link to that for information. This issue really came up from correspondence raised by the ETI committee, so it's really for copying that committee for information as well, just in the meantime, Chair. Other pieces of correspondence then, there's detailed correspondence at page 75 to 116 from DFP in relation to land and property services. It includes information on the measures that have been taken in relation to actionable debt recovery, which this committee has sought further details on. So it's in response to that, and also other issues that the committee has raised. So it's to note in the meantime, and also there's reference to a collection and recovery strategy being prepared if the committee wishes to request a copy of that once it's published, and in terms of also an indicative timeline for that. There will be an oral briefing scheduled as previously agreed, Chair, in due course from Land and Property Services. We'll cover these various issues. So it's really for members to note in the meantime, and if the committee wishes to request more information on the collection and recovery strategy in advance of an oral briefing session. Members are content, Chair.
Great.
And then there's page 116 of the pack. DFP's responding to various, it's really a partial response to various issues that the committee raised around the department's own budget position for 15-16, various outstanding issues. So there's an oral briefing from the department on its finalised budget plan for 15-16 is scheduled into the work programme, so for noting in the meantime. Also, similarly, there's a correspondence at page 130 on the review of the HR Connect full business case expenditure against the business case, and again there's a briefing scheduled on the wider performance against business plan targets by Enterprise Shared Services in the coming weeks, and that issue can be considered again at that session. There's correspondence at page 166 from the OFM-DFM committee. This is an annual kind of request from that committee for the other committees to comment on the European priorities, annual priorities. There's a research paper is still to be provided to the committee from the OFM-DFM, but just in advance of receiving that, if members are content for once that paper is received to be sent to DFP, because it will highlight the issues relevant to DFP remit for comment from the department, so that can then inform this committee's response to the OFM-DFM committee of members.
Great.
Content with that. Then, Chair, there's correspondence on page 169 from Northern Ireland Independent Retail Trade Association, requesting to brief the committee a delegation from the association that have issues in relation to the non-domestic revaluation, highlighting there that there's concerns around independent forecourts and issues in terms of Fermanagh area as well, in terms of some apparent kind of discrepancies or impacts from the reval. So if members are content to schedule an oral briefing on that from...
Have enough members?
Yeah. Great. And also there's an invite to members individually to attend a seminar on the reval that the association is holding on the 8th of February, just for members to note and to respond individually as in terms of if they plan to attend. That's really all the correspondence for decisions, Chair.
Okay. Committee work programme, members, pages 179, 283. Members content? Any other business? Next meeting will be Wednesday, 4th of February at 10 a.m.
This is the North